Good afternoon. Welcome to the Revenue Committee's interim hearing. My name is Brad Von Giller, and I serve as the vice chair for this committee. I'm from Elkhorn, Nebraska, and represent Legislative District 4. Today, the committee will hear two interim studies, LR 314, Senator Clements, and LR 435 from Senator Raybould. We'll have invited testimony only today. I'd like to introduce committee staff. To my left is legal counsel Charles Hamilton, and to my far left at the end of the table is committee clerk Linda Schmidt. Committee members with us today will introduce themselves beginning at my far right.
Kathleen Health, LD 31 in Millard.
Dave Merman from Glenville, represents southern part of Nebraska.
Elliot Bosar, District 29.
And
Perfect timing. George Duncan, LD 26, Northeast Lincoln.
great. Thank you. We'll begin today's hearing with the introduction of LR 14. Welcome up Senator Clements.
Thank you, Vice Chair Von Giller, members of the Revenue Committee. I'm Senator Rob Clements, ROB, CLE, MENTS, and I represent Legislative District 2. I'm here to present to you LR 314, an interim study to examine adjustments to county revenue sources to fund a phase out of the Nebraska inheritance tax. The binder that you received, you'll find that the items after the tabs or items provided by NACO. And what I'm going to make comments about will be the insert in the front of your folder. And I'll be describing some of those exhibits as we go. Over my time in the legislature, I've been part of efforts to improve Nebraska's inheritance tax structure to make us a more competitive as a state. I believe addressing Nebraska's inheritance tax is part of these efforts. It also has positive impacts on our families by preserving estate assets, increasing local private capital formation, and encouraging economic growth. Inheritance taxes have been repealed by 45 states since 1925, with 14 of those states dropping the tax since the loss of the state credit against federal estate tax in 2001. Nebraska kept its inheritance tax and remains the only state where it is paid to counties. Only 4 other states in the U.S. still collect inheritance tax: Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Maryland. Iowa was the 6th state, but its inheritance tax will be phased out January 1, 2025. Nebraska inheritance tax rates are drastically different based on how a descendant is related to the deceased, whether a child, niece, nephew, or non-relative. This is fundamentally unfair. 2 people could jointly inherit a property with the non-relative paying 15 times more than a child inheriting. In the 2024 session, I brought LB 1067 to phase out Nebraska's inheritance tax gradually by 2028. It came a few votes short of passing on general file. Then I worked with Senator McDonald on LB 1363 to raise revenue for counties through the dock stamp tax for a smaller cut. That bill did not advance. I'd like to thank NACO for hosting several stakeholder meetings this interim. The counties have expressed interest in phasing out inheritance taxes if we can find replacement revenues. Over this interim, I've worked with NACO to come up with some ideas for revenue replacement. I want to also thank John Cannon and Candace Meredith for their hard work on preparing summary sheets on various sources of county revenue. And those are the sheets that will be in your binder. These sheets are in your packet, and from these suggestions, I've proposed a list of possible revenue sources. The main ones I have selected include the documentary stamp tax, insurance premium tax, nameplate capacity tax, and the train car tax. Other smaller possibilities include updates to the marriage license, advertising, motor vehicle inspection, and distress warrant fees. The handout titled County Revenue Sources explains the changes in the estimated revenue generated for counties. So far, we haven't found enough revenue to completely eliminate the inheritance tax, but we can reduce it. So you should have a handout labeled doc stamp amounts that shows the current documentary tax allocation. The top is the current, the middle one is a possible reallocation, and the lower one would be showing what a change would be. And let's see here, so let's all find that. Then there's another handout I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time on. The title of it is County Revenue Sources List. And I'm going to be going through that line by line. The changes for documentary tax stamp starts on line 1 of the county revenue sources listing. Documentary tax stamp tax funding of 25 cents per thousand goes to Site and Building Development Fund. I'm proposing to transfer that to the counties. The fund would continue to function but receive new revenue either from DED general fund requests or individual bills. My staff researched the fund history and discovered this fund has functioned mostly as a flow-through fund for bills, with 47 million of flow-through from bills in the last 2 years. There's a handout farther down in these papers that shows Site and Building Fund history if you'd like to take a closer look. Next item on line 1 is affordable housing. The Affordable Housing Fund would go from 95 cents to 90 cents. The fund has been built up in recent years, and this year 12.5 million was transferred out to the rural workforce housing, and 12.5 million was transferred to middle income housing. The fund would still get $16.2 million a year rather than 17.1 million. Behavioral health is the next item, still on line 1. Behavioral health services would change from 30 cents to 25 cents to match the homeless shelter rate of 25 cents. It would change from $5.4 million a year to $4.5 million a year. Expenditures in behavioral health have been under $3 million a year, and the unspent fund balance is $12.6 million. So I don't think that would be hurting that fund. These first 3 changes on line 1 show a $6.3 million of revenue with those adjustments. Then line 2 would show the effect of increasing the dock tax. Line 1 wouldn't change the overall dock tax, but line 2 would increase it by 50 cents from $2 to $2.75 per thousand. That would add $125 to a $250,000 house sale, and it would generate $9 million of revenue if we allocate it all to the counties, which is my proposal. Then skip lines 3 through 6 and jump down to line 7. The insurance premium tax was originally acted in 1951. Prior to 1985, counties received 25% of the premium taxes. Then the fund shares were increased for cities and schools, and counties were reduced to 5%. I propose changing the state share from 40% to 35% and increasing counties to 10% of the $143 million total. This would be in a $7.2 million additional revenue. Next line is line 8, the nameplate capacity tax. The nameplate capacity tax was started in 2011 at a rate of $3,518 per megawatt. Since then, property taxes have increased 86%, averaging 4.55% per year, according to the Department of Revenue. But this tax rate has never changed. If the nameplate tax had increased the same as property taxes, it would be $6,560 per megawatt, a $3,042 increase. With the current distribution of the tax, which goes to counties, schools, and cities and whoever NRDs. The county portion would be 1.9 million of new revenue. Then that's line 8. Then line 9, if we could, if 100% of this increase would go to the counties, this would produce an additional $7.8 million. The next item is line 10, the car line tax, which is train cars. Currently, the $5 million of train car line tax is distributed according to property tax distributions. So counties receive about $550,000 of this amount. However, counties receive 100% of air carrier taxes. I propose to distribute the car line tax like the air carrier tax, so counties would receive all of the $5 million of revenue. There would be no change in the tax rate. Schools would lose about $3 million statewide, but equalization aid would offset some of that amount. Then the 4 other fees back on line 3 through 6. NACO pointed out 4 fees which have not been updated in many years. These include marriage license, advertising, motor vehicle inspection, and distress warrant fees. I estimate these fee updates would produce an extra 1.2 million of revenue for counties. NACO provided cost estimates to justify these proposed increases. The next sheet I'd like for you to turn is titled Inheritance Tax Change Proposals. The Inheritance Tax Change Proposal sheet shows the current county inheritance tax revenue and the effective changes in exemptions and rates. So the line that says current, that's where we are now with exemptions and rates. And you can show that the total tax column shows $93.7 million was actual receipts in the most recent year. This sheet's based on fiscal year 2024 inheritance tax reporting to the Department of Revenue. I would like to reduce class 2 and 3 rates first, which penalize people who are not children. Line 5, if you go down, shows exemptions changing to $50,000 for each of class 2 and 3 exemptions and 7% for the tax rate on class 2 and 3. This then in the tax change column shows $16.6 million decreased revenue. That would be covered by lines 1 through 6 back in the county revenue sources. The subtotal that was after line 6 was 16.5 million. And it'll depend on the committee which of these revenue items they want to accept. If they accepted just that, then the 7% rate is what we could go to. Then line 9, you'll see in bold, would lower the class 2 and 3 rates to 3%, which would need $27 million of revenue in the tax change column, which would be covered by lines 1 through 8, the subtotal after line 8 of the revenue sources handout. Then line 13, the bottom line on the proposal shows $100,000 exemptions for everybody and 0.9% rate for every category. And that could be covered by the grand total of revenue sources handout if all the new revenue proposals are enacted. I'll be glad to work with the committee to determine which proposals you might prefer as we go forward. In closing, a survey by the Platt Institute in 2021 found that 78% of Nebraska voters supported repealing the inheritance tax. Nebraska is losing retirees faster than we are gaining populations from other states. Our inheritance tax contributes to this outmigration. The inheritance tax is a very inconsistent form of revenue for most counties, where you can see that on the first chart, the graph how it goes up and it goes down. It fluctuates wildly from year to year. The changes I proposed would provide revenue that would be more stable. I believe we can do better as a state in this area and give people more reasons to stay in our state and not leave. I thank you for attending this LR study hearing today. Other testifiers will follow me, but I'll be happy to answer any questions at this time. Thank you.
Questions from the committee members? Senator Kauth.
Thank you, Chair Von Gillern. Senator Clements, when we were doing the inheritance tax debate this past year, there was a chart that showed how many, in some cases, years of inheritance taxes are held by some counties. Why wouldn't we just encourage the counties to, I mean, they're talking about wanting replacement revenue. Wouldn't we encourage them to do either cost cutting or choose their own ways of increasing their revenue if they need to, and partly using up the balance in their accounts? Because I think one had 37 years worth of collected
Well,
inheritance
The
tax.
report we had was over $200 million total statewide,
Mhm.
and it does vary quite a bit. Some counties carry millions and some don't have as much. I believe in speaking with NACO, they're trying to get NACO, get counties to reserve more out of their general funds and not rely on the inheritance tax so much in the future. I think they have not carried very much general fund reserves, which I also think would be the wise thing to do.
So wouldn't it be better for us to say as a state, rather than telling them what funds we are going to change, say, you guys figure it out because it's your taxpayers, it's your, I mean, they know their county intimately.
Well, that's why I proposed a 5-year phase in so that they would have time. It would just be gradually. It's like 1.5% a year of tax levy increase if they don't find cuts. It was a very minor amount per year, and I was hoping that that would be acceptable.
I still like that one better. Thank you.
Other questions? I have a quick question. Senator Clements, if we look at the county revenue sources list, I just want to make sure I'm understanding properly. Line 7 and line 9 would be shifts to the state or from the state, correct? Those are the 7.2 and 7.8 million. Are those dollars that the
Yes.
state is currently collecting now that the state would not?
On line 7, the 7.2 million, the state would have a general fund reduction of 7.2 million of
Okay.
insurance premiums. Line 9,
Line 9, they're not collecting now.
right, that would be a new tax.
Okay, all right. So if there was if this was an LD and it was a fiscal note, the fiscal note would be $7.2 million.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Senator Merman.
Yes, thank you. On line 10 of the sources, county sources list, the 5 million you mentioned, you would take some of that for property tax relief, or I guess all of it, but 3 million would still, approximately 3 million of that would be replaced through the TIOSA formula. So
Much of it would be, that's $5 million that's allocated to counties, schools, NRDs, and schools. I use 3 million because they're usually about 60% of the revenue of a property tax.
but that would be another source of revenue that would have to be replaced by
That would
the state.
That would reduce their resources in the TIOSA formula and provide more state aid. Again, would be a more likely a state revenue cost.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Bostar.
So if you would, following up, right, so, I don't know what share of that is really schools versus the NRDs and everything else, but if it did reduce resources triggering a higher allocation through TIOSA, then the fiscal note would be the 7.2 plus
Might be 3 million.
something like
Yeah,
that.
that's right. I should have noted that.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Seeing no other questions, thank you, Senator Clements.
Thank you. I'll be around for closing. And
Thank you. Our next invited, I'm sorry.
I'm done.
Next invited testimony is John Cannon.
Good afternoon. Is it Vice Chair or Chair Von Gillern today, sir?
Vice Chair. Well, I'm still Vice Chair of the committee.
Yes, sir.
Sitting in on behalf of Senator Linehan today.
Vice Chair Von Gillern, distinguished members of the Revenue Committee, my name is John Cannon, Joncannon. I'm the Executive Director of the Nebraska Association of County Officials, also known as NACO. Here to testify on this LR that we have before us. At first, I want to thank Senator Clements for the very diligent work and the great partnership that he has brought to this study. We very much appreciated his good faith efforts and also his staff. I'd have to mention Dan Wiles and Mark Freoff in particular, in working toward a common goal, trying to find adequate, sustainable replacement revenue, in return for an elimination or a reduction of the inheritance tax. A few notes on policy background before I go too much further into that. And so, the first question I always ask is, why do we have the tax in the first place? And why do we have taxes in the first place? And taxes are there because, and as members of the Revenue Committee know, I hope, we want participants in the society to pay for what they expect from the government. And so, what is it that we're having people pay for when they are paying things to the county? And you've heard this refrain before. For counties, we pay for roads, bridges, law enforcement, jails, courts, elections, and also the infrastructure, the fair and equitable administration of all of these things that come together to form county government. The first 2 pages of this section, I don't have the exact same notebook that you guys have. Senator Clements had access to it and added a little bit more. The first 2 pages after his section, you'll see how do counties spend their inheritance tax money. And from that, you can see the sorts of things that inheritance taxes have paid for in general. The next 3 pages are the inheritance tax receipts that we have by county over the last 3 years, coming up, accumulating in a 3-year average. So I think that's also very helpful to look at. And then the next 4 pages show specific items and projects broken down by those counties who we had reply. So we turn our attention to what we are going to tax. A tax is a government's accession to the combined wealth of the people that it governs or are subject to its jurisdiction. And so we need to look at the different modes of wealth and different inflection points for measuring that wealth. So in the property tax, it's the annual assessment of real property or personal property as measured by its market value. For sales tax, it's when wealth is expended through the purchase of a good and maybe sometimes a service, depending on how far we want to go in our next several legislative sessions. For income tax, it's when wealth is increased through an income stream. And so the inheritance tax, it's when that inflection point is when wealth is transferred from a deceased to a beneficiary. There are pros and cons for each of these inflection points and each of these ways that we have of measuring it. But by and large, that is what we have here as far as the 4 main methods of taxation. And as you all know, counties are limited to only 2 of those incidences of wealth in their communities. We have a tax on property that comes from the annual assessment of the fair market value of property. And then we have when wealth transfers to an heir. Counties do not collect sales or income taxes. If I suggested that counties wanted to, I'm pretty sure Lynn Rex would be here in a heartbeat. Any other revenues that we may have are limited to transfers from the state or federal governments or the collection of fees that are specific to a service provided. And those fees are determined, they're set by the state. We don't get to say, you know what, marriage licenses cost $50 for us to process, therefore we're going to raise we don't get to do that. That's something set by the legislature. And so let's be clear, nobody really likes taxes. I know I like to talk about taxes, but that's not quite the same thing. And in the abstract, absolutely. Nebraska's citizens are in favor of sharply reducing or eliminating every tax that there is. Some taxes are less favored than others. For years, we've been talking about the inheritance tax. And so because of that, we decided that we wanted to do a little bit of a study on that. And I think what I'll point out is that what people like in the abstract is not necessarily what they prefer in practice. And so also as part of our packet, you'll have the results of a survey that I've handed out to this committee before about the inheritance tax. We commissioned a survey last year to find out how our citizens felt about the inheritance tax compared to other taxes and how they felt about the services provided to the county by their counties. And the citizenry said in fairly overwhelming fashion that they did not favor eliminating inheritance taxes if it meant that either property taxes would go up or the services they expect from their county government would be reduced. So there's a couple pages. The next 2 pages I would point out are titled Potential Property Tax Increases Due to Loss of Inheritance Tax Revenue. And that shows what the property tax is paid by the average homeowner. We took the average assessed value of single family residential in each county. We figured out what the levy rate would be if the inheritance tax was not available for property tax relief in our rough measure. And I'll note that in 5 of those counties, the levy rate goes over the constitutionally mandated 50-cent levy lid that we have as counties. And those would be Cheyenne, Dual, Garden, Garfield, and Kimball. So a lot of this is information that you've received before. What we all heard when we were discussing inheritance taxes this last spring is that reducing or eliminating inheritance tax has to be accompanied by replacement revenue. We had a couple of efforts to look at replacement revenue in the waning days of the session, as Senator Clements ably described, and the clock ran out on us. And I think it was a genuinely good faith effort to try and find a means of starting to reduce the inheritance tax and the county's reliance on it. However, what we did discover is that we have some common ground for working on the issue. I know that particularly when it comes to the inheritance tax, NACO has probably developed a reputation, justified in my opinion, that we dig in its heels. By the same token, many of our folks in the county level have been conditioned to believe that the legislature only wants to rip away the inheritance tax without any consideration for the real damage it would cause to our citizens. So NACO did the unexpected, and we decided we were going to work with Senator Clements and other stakeholders. And so Senators Clements, Dorn, Raybould, Conrad, Dover, Holdcroft, Jacobson, and Von Gillern were convened as a stakeholder group, as well as our friends from the Open Sky and Platt Institutes, to really dig into what the costs of government are and how that's affected by the revenue streams that we have available to us as counties, and otherwise are subsidized through property taxes. I think it's exciting too. We also looked at those things that are collected at the local level and remitted to the state, particularly the documentary stamp tax and the various motor vehicle taxes. So in advance of the stakeholder group meeting, we spent hundreds of hours discussing the costs of government with every level of county government that you've got in the courthouse. And we learned quite a few things. Not related to this discussion, I'm going to point out though, every single office in the courthouse will tell you that mental health is affecting the cost of their services more and more with increasing frequency. And so something I was kind of surprised by, but in retrospect, perhaps I shouldn't have been quite so surprised. When it came to this work, NACO's Deputy Director, Candace Meredith, did the lion's share of the work with those subcommittees, and she will go into further detail following my testimony. One last thing I should mention, actually, second to last thing I should mention, as Senator Clements had mentioned, a number of states have phased out the inheritance tax over time. Nebraska is the only state that has, and the only state I believe that has ever had, the inheritance tax go directly to its counties. For every other state that's out there, the inheritance tax goes directly to the state, and it just becomes accounting dust. And so it was probably a lot easier for the state to say we're going to swallow whatever those receipts were. The last thing I do want to mention is the Constitution. Article 8, Section 1 begins by saying that the necessary revenue of the state and its governmental subdivisions shall be raised by taxation in such manner as the legislature shall direct. I think it's notable that the second word of that constitutional provision is necessary, the necessary revenue. If the state imposes requirements on counties, the duties that the legislature puts upon us, and limits our ability to fund those duties, has the legislature done its job of directing how the necessary revenues are raised? I won't go into the various ways that counties are already restricted in fulfilling those duties. That's a discussion for another day, and believe me, we'll be here for that. But I will say that the reduction or elimination of a revenue stream without adequate replacement makes the fulfillment of those duties very, very difficult. We are taking, as counties, a huge risk by embarking on this journey when we're looking at a $100 million revenue stream. I think it was $96 million last year. And breaking it into several smaller revenue streams as we're proposing. There's nothing that stops a future legislature from deciding to ratchet down a rate or removing a revenue source and appropriating it for the state's purposes. While everyone in this room, I trust you all implicitly, I don't know who's going to be sitting in your seats 8, 10, 20 years from now. And so we would suggest something as a safeguard for local political subdivisions in the Constitution, something as simple as if the state, through legislative action, reduces or eliminates a non-property tax revenue stream previously available to a local governmental subdivision, such reduction or elimination shall be replaced through either an appropriation from the state, an alternative revenue stream, or both, as necessary. Thank you again for your attention. I want to again thank Senator Clements and his staff for their diligent partnership, the excellent work that they've done in presenting all this information for us today. I also want to thank the staff at NACO that has worked particularly on this issue. Candace Meredith, the NACO Deputy Director, Luke Bonkowicz, our lead researcher, Riley Sigler, who's our Education and Community Engagement Specialist, Beth Farrell, who's our staff counsel. In particular, those folks have done an admirable job of getting this information collected and put in front of you today. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cannon. Questions from the committee? Senator Bostar.
Thank you, Chairman Gillard. Thank you, Mr. Cannon, for being here. Proposing a constitutional amendment to say that we will just replace the funding, non-property tax funding for counties if it was eliminated. Why? I mean, the counties are creations of the state, right? They're not. Their existence comes from the state. Everything about them comes from the state. Why should counties receive a special provision in the Constitution?
Well, I'm not suggesting that it apply only to counties. First, I would suggest that it apply to local governmental subdivisions. And the reason I do that is because Article 8, Section 1 specifically refers to the state and its political subdivisions, or its governmental subdivisions.
But if we wanted to say, get rid of all the counties and take a different structure of local government, we could. We don't need counties.
Well, except for the fact that we were referenced in the Constitution several times.
Sure. But but we can make them what we want. Regardless. In a scenario where, we talk about how the devastating impact of losing the revenue for the constituents in the counties, if we were to eliminate the inheritance tax. Did NACO take a position of opposition when we reduced the income taxes?
No, we did not.
Are the constituents that are served by income tax revenue the same as those that are served by the counties and their property taxes and their inheritance taxes?
I would presume yes.
So why did you not have a position that you cared about the revenue for the services in that case?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question, Senator, and I'll respond. Actually, this kind of spills over a little bit into our next LR, which is, what are the sorts of things that are required to be funded by the state? What are the sorts of things that are required to be funded by the locals? And I think on the property tax side, there's a provision that we have in the Constitution that the state shall not impose a property tax for state purposes. And there are a lot of questions as to what sorts of things are the counties doing or the locals doing that are state issues. And one thing I'll mention just in particular, kind of a spoiler alert for the coming session, riparian vegetation management. The Republican River Compact between Nebraska and Kansas requires us to give a certain amount of water to the state of Kansas every year. And through the propagation of Phragmites in the Republican River Basin, we were not able to meet our obligation to the state of Kansas. And so we went into a riparian vegetation management program. We appropriated a certain amount, and we were sued, by the way, by the state of Kansas for $72 million. We appropriated a certain amount of money, and we said, we're going to have the weed superintendents in the various counties take care of these sorts of things. Something that is clearly a state issue. The state of Kansas wasn't suing Hitchcock County. The state of Kansas was suing the state of Nebraska. But we decided that we're going to have the locals take care of those sorts of things. And the Supreme Court has ruled in the past, they've said, there are certain things that the state and its political subdivisions do that have a mix of state and local results. And we're generally okay with that. But I think this gets to the heart of your question, though, sir, which is you can, I guess you can conceive of a way that the locals and the state are bound up all together, and you know, we care just as deeply about the income tax and the sales tax and those sorts of things as perhaps the premise of your question would have us. But that's not the system we have right now. And I also think that if we did wade into the issue of income taxes or sales taxes, people are probably going to look at us pretty funny. Like, what are you doing here?
I understand. I think the point, though, is if the position is, well, these are separate things, and as you said, the state doesn't collect property taxes, we spend a great deal of time and effort and resources and energy and focus on addressing property taxation
You do so very
for the
ably, sir.
people of Nebraska.
Yep, and you do so very ably, sir.
Well, thank you. So I think if we are engaging in a holistic view of taxation for Nebraskans, even including taxes that we don't collect, we don't spend, we don't distribute, I think it makes sense for an organization like NACO, which represents all of the exact same people through constituencies that we do, to also take a broader view of taxation. If NACO's going to only take their piece, then why should the legislature not do the same thing?
If I'm hearing you correctly, sir, then I mean, if we all retreat to our separate corners, then you're right. The state, the revenue committee probably wouldn't have anything to say at all about property taxes, and we all of course know that that's not the case.
Yeah. I think that'd be wrong. I think it'd be bad. I don't want us to do that.
Sure.
I don't think it makes sense.
And you know, and I guess my response to that though is that, as you pointed out, we're creatures of the state, and when it comes to how we raise our revenues, that's something that's going to be directed first by the revenue committee, and then once it gets on the floor by the full legislature. And so, because of that, you know, we collect property taxes. We're going to be there on property taxes. We don't collect sales and income taxes. Now, I would tell you that when it comes to any time that you guys discuss sales taxes, to the extent that it's going to affect local option sales tax, I don't want to speak for Lynn Rex, but I suspect that they're going to be there testifying about it, because that is something that has an effect on the cities for the duties that they have to collect those taxes in their locations. We don't have a sales tax. We don't have an income tax. That's not a duty that's been assigned to us, and so therefore, I think that's probably why we don't show up.
And I understand. I get that logic. It's just, if we're going to say the sky is falling because we're talking about eliminating one kind of tax, but then at the same time we're cutting all these other taxes that affect the exact same people and the services that potentially, the capacity for services that could be provided to them, there's just a discontinuity in sort of how that conversation happens, and who comes forward about the impact that taxes have on people.
Yeah, sure. I appreciate that. You know, and to the extent that if NACO has ever been perceived as saying that the sky is falling about inheritance taxes or property taxes, that's probably true. I will say, not to say that the sky is falling, but I will point out that in 2023, counties collected $865 million in property taxes for the county, and we collected just under $100 million in receipts for the inheritance tax. And so the spend from county government was $965 million, and removing $100 million, and that's an 11%. It's either an 11% increase in property taxes to make it up, or it's an 11% roughly 11% decrease in services to account for that. So, you know, those are the things that we work with. 11% is a big deal. That would be hard for our citizens to absorb.
The last sort of subject on here, and I haven't sort of mapped out a scenario on this, but take the rail car tax, if that went just to counties. So I was trying to think about this. So if some of it goes to schools now, and if it went all to counties, but the county's not at their levy lid, then they would just have to levy for more. But equalization wouldn't necessarily just pick it up if they're not.
For the counties?
No, for schools.
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, sir.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Senator Cal.
Thank you, Vice Chair Von Gillern. Mr. Cannon, can you define necessary as you used the term that you have to use these taxes for necessary things?
Sure. I would say it's probably something that has the quality of being required.
Like what?
Well,
I mean, is there a written definition of what are those necessary things that the county is responsible for?
yes, I would say that they're in chapters 1 through 91 of the Nebraska Revised Statutes.
Okay, so anything that is the mandates or the requirements the state has put on you are those requirements.
Sure.
Has there been an audit of how the money has been spent to actually fulfill those requirements, to see if the requirements are the things that are being fulfilled first?
In audit by
By the counties, like
every county is audited. Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
Okay, and so they can say, okay, here we met our obligations, like 1 through 91 statutes, we met all of those. Then is there money left over, or are there other things that are being used, or that money is being used for, that are not required?
I would be hard pressed to think of any situation where there are monies being used by counties that are not either required or authorized by state statute.
Okay.
Now, what those spending decisions are by the counties, those are subject to local control, which is something that we prize in the state for a long, long time. And so, if the question is whether or not one county should have full health insurance benefits for an employee and then partial health benefits for that employee's family, or whether they should offer health insurance at all. There's 2 counties that don't. That's a local decision that's being made, but it's only made because it's been either required or authorized by statute.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Senator Duncan.
Thank you, Vice Chair Von Gillern. Thank you, Mr. Cannon. It's always nice to have you back in this room. I'm sure
Thank
we'll
you,
see a lot of you next year as well.
Depending on how this whole hearing goes, I might not be back.
We'll find out. Do you have a copy of this sheet that we were provided by Senator Clements with the 10 things listed as county revenue sources?
Not in front of me. I think I set it aside when I was preparing for my testimony.
You don't have to, I
today.
guess, but you're familiar with it.
I am.
suppose,
I
right?
have seen it. Yes, sir.
And you heard Senator Clements' opening testimony about that as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay. You were just handed a copy of that.
Yes, sir. I was.
Okay. So like on here, we have 10 different sources that are, I guess, proposed, it sounds like, by Senator Clements, including 4 of lines 3 through 6, which are the increases in fees, which I know last session were things that we discussed with regards to regressivity and whether or not increases in fees have a disproportionate impact on certain parts of the population. Is it your understanding from your time in this working group that these 10 proposed revenue sources have been agreed upon by everybody? Is there a consensus that these are things that you all would be okay with? Is this NACO saying you'd be okay with these? Or is this just what Senator Clements, to the best of your understanding, is proposing?
So we've worked very diligently with Senator Clements. He's been a great partner throughout all of this. When we had the stakeholder group, we talked about a number of the things that are on this sheet. Some of them, as you had suggested, there's questions about whether it's regressive or not. And it appears to me, I mean, the fees that are listed on here, just in particular, there's a lot more than just those. And so marriage license fees, advertising delinquent taxes, which is something that is required when you're advertising for delinquent taxes, motor vehicle inspections, those are probably less regressive in their nature. And I think those were selected because it was thought that they would probably meet with the least opposition. Now, and Ms. Meredith is going to speak more to this in the books that you have in front of you. There's a lot of information that we put together on the various fees, taxes, et cetera, that we collect or that we share in on a series of policy recommendations as well. And so to an extent that we informed the decision as to put, whether or not these should appear on this sheet, we certainly did. However, we don't do any selecting. All we can do is recommend. And ultimately, assuming there's a bill brought next year, it's this committee that will make hay with whichever recommendations they go with.
No, and that makes sense. And I guess I want to ensure I understand sort of what's being represented to the committee, right? Is it that these are proposals being recommended by Senator Clements in consultation with a group of individuals? Or is this in fact something that all of the group of individuals have agreed, this is what we should do, this is our proposal?
Yep.
And I think those are two very different things. Because
Right.
I think when presented with a list of 10 things, with an understanding that we got together with a bipartisan group of stakeholders and all of them now have said, this is what we should do, that's different than we talked with a number of folks and this is what some of us have proposed. And so do you have an understanding as to whether or not this is a consensus agreement from that working group, or are these just recommendations based on conversations that were had?
Sure. To answer your question directly, Senator, we never took a vote. And so from that perspective, no, it would not represent a consensus. And frankly, the stakeholder group that we had, there were 14 people on there. And frankly, I think if you put this sheet in front of them and said, for whatever reason, if you said pick the 7 or 8 that you like the most out of this, for some reason you get 15 different responses, and I'm just sure of it. And so I'm not going to represent that this reflects a consensus, but what I can tell you is that we had the stakeholder group, we took a lot of input, and then the last, probably for the last month and a half or so, really the conversation has been mostly between NACO and Senator Clements' office. We had our policy recommendations that we had put out there, and I believe that was culled from those recommendations into the sheet that you see in front of you.
And as somebody who works in both the county government field as well as you have a background in property tax in general, are there any revenue sources that you believe or NACO believes would be also helpful for us to look at that are not reflected on this sheet? Are there additional sources that you believe are being untouched with these proposals?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate the question. So in the booklet that we have in front of you, I think it's after the yellow tab. I don't know where in here it is, but there are some proposals for alternative revenue sources. I'll point out the first one that comes to mind. I'm not going to say it's anything beyond a crazy idea, but we've talked in various circles about an I-80 surcharge. Essentially a 2% additional sales tax on all retail sales made within a quarter mile of I-80. I-80 has in the last 5 years has had at least 4 billion travel miles on it every year. And a lot of those travel miles are by people that don't live here. One of the things that we look for in tax policy is we like adequacy, simplicity, transparency, and we also like exportability. And so to the extent that people that are using our roads that don't live here and don't vote here, to the extent that we can make them defray some of the costs that we bear, those are things that are all to the good. So that's just one suggestion. Again, I don't know if it has legs. I suspect the streamlining group have something to say about it. Perhaps the Federal Trade Commission, who knows? The imagination is boundless.
Nobody's always happy, right?
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Gannon. I appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Other questions? I just have a couple. The inheritance tax, are funds that are collected from inheritance tax, are those restricted funds that can only be used for certain items within a county?
No, sir.
So I'm looking at the document that you provided about what these projects were funded from inheritance tax. How, if the money just went into general fund, how do we identify what those dollars were spent for?
Yeah, so typically, and I suspect Ms. Meredith will have a much better answer for you, or at least more complete answer for you. So as those inheritance tax funds are collected, most counties will put them into a separate inheritance tax fund. When it comes time to expend those funds, however, they'll do a transfer from the inheritance tax fund to the road fund, the general fund, the maintenance fund, whichever fund it needs to go into, and from that they'll those different departments within the county will spend it as they see fit.
So then maybe that answers my question. Douglas and Lancaster are not listed in this list.
No, they're not.
So presumably that those funds went into general fund.
Yeah, the inherit. So in Lancaster County, I know for a fact that they take their inheritance tax receipts and they put them directly into the general fund.
Okay.
So it just becomes, and so it directly buys down the property tax levy in Lancaster.
And again, not nitpicking, but under Sarpy County, it says the funds were used for loan repayment. I would find that odd to be using a unpredictable source of revenue to be using for loan repayment,
Well,
unless that was an accelerated pay down of a loan.
The good news about the law of large numbers, sir, is that in Douglas, Lancaster, Sarpy, and also to a certain extent Hall and Buffalo counties, those counties are large enough where they can pretty accurately model what their receipts are going to be on a year-for-year basis. Generally, the people that do the modeling are going to be very, very conservative. And so if they're off, typically they're going to have more in receipts than they projected.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Is there any way, do the counties track at all the average size of the payment that comes in, the average size of the state tax that comes in, and from that you could interpolate back to the average size of the estate? I'm curious whether the average estate that gets taxed, is it a $50,000 estate, $100,000 estate, $1 million estate?
I'm not sure if we have that information, and so again, I will defer to Ms. Meredith. You're probably
Okay.
wondering, why isn't she running the place?
She's got tough stuff coming up here.
Yeah, sometimes I wonder myself.
At least she knows what the questions are going to be, though.
Yes, sir. So she got a little bit of an advance warning.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And lastly, not really a question, but I found it humorous that younger men are the most likely to find the inheritance tax acceptable, while older men are the least likely. Well, I was once a younger man, and I understand that completely now, so.
My daughter doesn't believe that I was ever a younger man,
Yeah.
but I'm with you on that.
Yeah,
I feel your
Younger
pain.
men don't have any money and they're never going to die, so it's not much of a concern, so. Any other questions? Senator Bostar?
Thank you, Chair. Just to throw in, it's my understanding that Lancaster County's inheritance tax collections came in under their plan projections last year by several $1 million.
Oh, that would be a surprise to me. Okay.
That's all I have.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you, Mr. Cannon.
Thank you.
With great anticipation, we invite up Candace Meredith.
Run.
Yeah, exactly. No pressure.
Welcome.
Hey, good afternoon. Candace Meredith, CandaceMeredith. To answer that last question on averages, I was looking at our NACO team. We'll have to follow up on that question because I'm not
Thank
quite
you.
sure.
You understand why I'm asking that question?
Absolutely,
Thank
yes. Yeah, we'll definitely follow up on that. So I am here today to really follow up on the stakeholder working group that we did and the work that the NACO staff did on this project over the spring and the summer. After the session, our NACO board of directors did approve for the NACO staff to put together an inheritance tax working group to study the legislation that impacts counties' revenues under underfunded and unfunded mandates. Again, with the reduction or elimination of such a large amount of our revenues, we wanted to look outside of property taxes to see what we could do to help either look at antiquated statutes, look at our technology, what we can do to modernize, and also look at our current revenue generators that we have out there and just really start taking that deep dive in. So what we started, again, we sit here in Lincoln at the NACO office, there's only so much that we know. So we did start off, created a whole bunch of subcommittees on every single office. And then we also did it by district. And then we also, even as John mentioned, we found in all of the conversations we had with the committees, the mental health component came up several times in different ways. So we found that quite fascinating. So we put together what we call like an HHS committee to explore what they're seeing out there and what challenges that they're going through, just to have that on record. So again, April to now is a very short amount of time. So again, this study is still ongoing, but what I can share with you today is what we went over with the stakeholder group that John mentioned. And we really started taking a dive into some of our revenue generators or our non-property tax revenues to see if there was any opportunity for some sustainable revenue replacement that maybe provided more stability in when we talk about small, medium, and large counties, because obviously not every county is different, not one size fits all. So what we'll talk about today here is just to kind of go through on a high level. Again, Senator Von Gilleren's been through this already, so it's probably going to be a little bit boring for him, but I just wanted to highlight some areas here based off of Senator Clements' county revenue source list. We can touch on some of those, but this was basically put together for the stakeholders. So as you guys are, looking at these sorts of revenues, what stakeholders are impacted? You just mentioned, if we do one sort of revenue sourcing, it obviously shifts from one place to the other. So it's just something that we have to be mindful of when we're having these discussions. So we just wanted to put that out there for consideration and what fits best going forward. So in the packet here, we start with the documentary stamp tax, which is part of Senator Clements' proposal. So we just basically started off with what the purpose of the doc stamp is, who are all the stakeholders that are impacted by the doc stamp that the counties collect. We also put a financial analysis together and some recommendations. The one thing I want to note about doc stamps in particular, if we're going to talk about a reduction in our class 2 and 3 overall percentage decreases, we just want to be mindful of the law of large numbers. So obviously when we start decreasing, there's enough in the large counties that the fiscal impact, they'll be somewhat okay, depending on what threshold we go. But small and medium counties, obviously there's not a lot of transfers going on there, so there's not a really good split there. But the good thing about it is we can forecast what our doc stamps are. It's a more steady stream than it would say an inheritance tax. So that's just what I wanted to note on that. Marriage license also, and again, what this we found out pretty quick, especially when after the special session, we started tackling modeling on going from the lid on restricted funds to the cap. We also started looking at, other property tax relief mechanisms because the two obviously go hand in hand. So there's a lot of fees that are in statute that haven't been updated in quite a long time, or really are under the cost of the service that the county is providing. And so what we also did when we were looking at this, yes, it was an inheritance tax study, but we also found that there might be opportunities for the property tax relief in between the two. So they do go hand in hand. So we did, in some of these, you'll see like what our surrounding states around us, what they're currently charging for marriage licenses, just to give us an idea, are we under, are we over, where are we at? So we did include that information as well. So that's in there for your consideration to review. The one thing that we would like to consider going forward when we talk about these fees, it's been somewhat of a sensitive issue throughout the years, but either having some sort of review of fees to make sure that the cost is in line with the actual fee. So as we get into inflationary environments, times change, that we can properly accelerate with that. Again, that little bit more local control that you were talking about, Senator, giving us a little bit more authority to kind of move in that direction that we need to go by local decision. Next, we had advertising fees. So our advertising fees are basically the fees that we attach to delinquent taxes. The treasurers have to publish in a newspaper very specific details about the delinquent taxes. So they have to put names, they have to put addresses, legal description, amount. It's gotten quite expensive. Publication is not cheap. $2 doesn't even touch what the tens of thousands of dollars it costs to publish 3 lists in, so we have to do 3 consecutive Saturdays. They have to report that list. In addition, they have to also report on their website and to the Nebraska Department of Revenue, just to make sure that we're transparent, that those homeowners know that their taxes are delinquent. So the cost of advertising has gone up quite extensively. So we gave you the numbers on what that looks like on average. Next on Senator Clements' proposal, there was the motor vehicle inspections. Motor vehicle fraud has become a little bit more intense. It's getting quite creative, and sometimes these things are time consuming. Going from $10 to $20, it's still right there in the national average. Again, just really compensating for those very specific things that we have to do statutorily to make sure that we mitigate fraud and theft. Again, distress warrant fees. So it's kind of scary word, but distress warrant fees are basically the mobile home delinquent taxes. So if mobile homes and personal property taxes go delinquent, the treasurer will give a report to the sheriff, and the sheriff is responsible for collecting those taxes. And so again, $2 for the administrative cost for a sheriff to go out and collect on these taxes is just, again, quite minimal and does not definitely exceed the cost. So it's really going over to property taxes at this point. Insurance premium tax. Again, that's another tax that is out there. We do get a very small portion at this time. We get basically 10% of 10% of the insurance tax fund. That has changed over time. We used to get more back. I think it was predated in the 80s, but that was changed by the legislation and cut back tremendously. So we lost some revenues there. So Senator Clements has that in his proposal as a recommendation to increase a portion to the counties as an offset to revenue. Again, this is one of those things that's kind of a risk for counties if we're going to talk about revenue replacement for inheritance tax. That's why that constitutional amendment might be, an optimal solution, so it doesn't come back on property taxes later on, because the counties still have to provide those essential services to the citizens. The nameplate capacity tax on these worksheets. This is not in all counties, so I just wanted to, again, when we're talking about revenue replacement for all 93 counties, nameplate is not in all 93 counties. So we want to be mindful of that revenue. We do appreciate Senator Clements bringing this forward, because I think it is time for review. It's been the same for quite a while. So we appreciate that we're having the conversation to look at this and work with the stakeholders in this area to see where we need to be fair and equitable with that nameplate capacity tax for solar and wind energy taxes. But again, a little leery about this, with revenue placement for inheritance, because again, not all counties have this tax right now. Next, we have the air carrier and car line. So as Senator Clements mentioned, air carrier counties get 100%. Again, the car line, it was another opportunity in his proposal to switch that over, but understanding the stakeholders being the schools getting a larger portion of that can impact that formula as well. So, and again, that's mentioned in those recommendations. And this one is the next one I'm talking, the motor vehicle taxes one I'm pretty excited about, and I'm hoping this comes up. When we look at your little pink slip here, again, when we were working with Dan and Mark, talking about through these a little bit more detail after the stakeholder meetings, we got into some great conversations about our pink slips and how high a cost it is. And, taking a deep dive in that now, this is another one where, there's the motor vehicle taxes. You'll see in here, motor vehicle taxes right now, there's we have detail of what that looks like for motor vehicle. Behind the motor vehicle tax, there is this motor vehicle 2023 motor vehicle taxes sheet that the Department of Motor Vehicle puts out to let you know how much money is being distributed. But I think there's opportunity there in maybe a possible hearing or further discussion on how maybe we could possibly look at our motor vehicle taxes and fee structure and how those funds should be distributed going forward. Again, it takes a lot more time and diligence and thoughtful process to go through and revamp that. But we've heard a lot in the news about, a lot of cars are either not licensed or licensed in different states. You've seen a lot of those articles. So maybe it's time to take a look at this area and see what opportunities there might be in the future for that. So there's motor vehicle taxes, motor vehicle fees, against motor vehicle sales tax. So this is another thing that the counties collect on behalf of the state. The counties do keep a small portion of that, and then the rest is remitted to the state. Now, from the state then, some of it goes to the Department of Transportation, and then other parts come back to the cities and counties to help out with some fees for infrastructure. So again, taking a look at the sales tax opportunities there, to look at that distribution factor, to make sure we're all in common area to keep our infrastructure strong. Title fees is another one as well. Title fees, we also discussed. Again, we're a little light with these $10 a title fee. Again, kind of tied back to, fraud prevention. And then motor vehicle prorate tax is another one to look at. This is a distribution based off of the ad valorem as well. So something that we can also look at in the future. The one thing that I would say that when we're talking with the stakeholder group, which I think we had really great conversations on, was the civil fees. That's where it got a little bit, we're like, we need to take a little bit closer look at that. We did visit with Senator Conrad this last week, that I did last week, about these civil fees, and she was going to take a look at them and see what opportunities there might be to either eliminate some of these fees, because some of them are so small. It's like, why are we even going there? It costs more to collect than it's worth, and maybe putting some more emphasis on some common ground and things that maybe could be increased to help offset administrative costs. So just continuing to have that conversation with Senator Conrad to get her insight has been quite helpful. And then as far as the new ideas that came through those subcommittee meetings, I just wanted to share with you guys. Again, a lot of great ideas out there, but I wanted to capture some of them. John did mention the interstate surcharge. Another idea that came out of the subcommittee groups was, again, we haven't really studied it, just threw it out there, was the local taxation on medical marijuana, county sales tax with voter approval, supporting the increase of legal documentation of motor vehicles, again, with that fraud protection. Another one was considering like a partial exemptions on high value parcels. So there's lots of real estate tax exemptions. There's quite a few motor vehicle tax exemptions. Obviously the increase in valuation, maybe looking at partial exemptions on some of those higher values, or even possibly doing a review of what we have going on with our motor vehicle exemptions and property tax exemptions as well. So those were some ideas that came out of the committees. The other thing I just wanted to bring up too that Senator Clements talked about is over the last 2 years, we've been working with the state auditor's office on cash reserves. Again, some of these cash reserves are very small because there's been a reliance on the inheritance tax to use that as the cash reserve. So we've been working with the auditor's office as well as National GFOA to build out templates to help counties forecast. Because it's just not a normal business where you have to have 2 months of operating supplies. You have to be responsive to snow emergencies. You have to be responsive to a bridge going out. You have to be responsive to a road being washed out. High dollar expenses. So you have to be responsive because unfortunately, if you don't have enough cash, you have to go to loan or a bond. And that is then causing more money to have to go out through property taxes, unfortunately. So having good cash reserves on hand will actually end up reducing the burden for the citizens when they don't have to account for interest like that. So we're working on that, getting that education out. And as I said, this is a work in progress. We have a lot of things in the hopper when it comes to unfunded and underfunded mandates. We decided to tackle the behavioral health concerns that we have in the jails, in our nursing homes. So that's taken quite a bit of time because there's a lot of information out there. We want to make sure our content's accurate. So that's what we're currently working on. But in the meantime, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and just thank you for your time. Thank you to Senator Clements, Dan, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee? Senator Kauth.
Thank you, Chair Von Gillen. So all of your testimony is focused on raising taxes, which raising the costs, raising the fees. Are there any cost-cutting measures we can do as far as getting rid of some of those statutes and cutting expenses that way so that you're not being mandated to do certain things? And we have 93 counties. Are there ways that they can be combining with each other? Maybe not a consolidation, but working together to say, okay, you take care of this. And it just seems like the answer cannot be to continuously raise fees to lower taxes. That's not going to be effective long term. We're still taking more money from people.
Sure. So I believe that the underfunded and unfunded mandates we've already uncovered some antiquated statutes, and we're like questioning why are counties doing this at this point, or are there private companies out there that are supporting these services that we're required to do? So I would say I believe that there is. There's been some really good conversations with these subcommittees. We're like, why are we? This is from 1957. Why are we still doing this? So yes, I do think they're out there. We just wanted to try to get something, and the easiest thing for us right now to do is the revenue generators, just to kind of go through that because that information is quite readily available to us. The second question is interlocals. I can't even probably count how many interlocals there is. I mean, the auditor has that information, but there's tons of interlocals, and it's just not county to county. It's county to city, county to village. There's a lot of sharing that happens out there. Obviously, we see it in the city, like coming from Lancaster. There's a lot of city, Lincoln, Lancaster. I know Douglas and Omaha do a lot of sharing. Buffalo and Kearney are a great example of their law enforcement. And if Neil was here, he would tell it. This is an amazing story. I get goosebumps every time I hear what they do. But there is stories all over where we do that. And I think, just in my 5 years of being at NACO, I'm just so impressed with the thoughtfulness that happens at the county level when they think about how they can partner up and do things like that. I've even heard stories where, like, Keith County, I remember talking with the former highway superintendent about how they share equipment with each other in Ogallala, Keith County, and across the border, just to save on costs. So one will buy one piece and the other one will buy another one, and they'll swap to save money. So there's stories out there. You just probably don't hear about them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Other questions? Senator Boster.
Thank you, Chair. The insurance premium tax,
Yes.
can you tell me how that 5% is distributed to counties? What sort of methodology is used to actually distribute it?
So are you currently under that insurance tax fund?
Yeah, currently.
So what happens is the state will give the county the premium amount, and that premium then will be distributed to the the school gets their portion. Let me go to insurance here. I'm sorry, I'm thinking motor vehicle
So the
program.
counties get 5%. They get 10% of the insurance tax fund, which is
Yes.
5% of insurance premium tax collections.
Correct. So the state of Nebraska will send the county's portion to them for deposit.
And how is the county's portion determined?
That, let's see here.
That's really what I'm trying to get at, is how is it decided, Boone County, how much do they get of that pot? Lancaster, Sarpy, what's the formula?
I will have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, thank you. And you talked, actually just related, you talked about the historically this looked different.
Correct. There was a time, I believe it was in the 1980s, the formula was changed.
What did it look like before?
I believe, do we have that in here? I want to say we put it in here. Oh, here it is. The insurance premium tax was originally enacted in 1951. Prior to January 1985, counties received 50% of the fund. And then the fund was expanded to allocate 30% to municipalities and 60% to schools.
So counties receive 50% of the
insurance
tax fund?
The portion of the insurance tax fund.
Do you happen to know what the other 50% of that was at that time?
But I can find out.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Senator Duncan.
Thank you, Vice Chair Von Gilbert. And you answered some of the questions I had earlier for Mr. Cannon, so I appreciate that. A couple of things I wanted to touch on, though. So going back, again, I think Senator Kauf might have made some of the points I was going to make with regard to fees, but I missed the first part of that. You discussed in your testimony the fact that based on your analysis, the fees are not keeping up with the cost of the services that the fees themselves are being used to administer, right? So like marriage license fees and things like that. What we're proposing here, though, is an increase in those fees in an effort to gain more money to then use that to pay for additional services beyond just the administration of that individual thing, right? Because if we're trying to make up replacement revenue for what inheritance taxes are used for, we're essentially saying we want to increase the fees to a high enough point that A, it pays for the service of that individual thing, and then B, gains enough revenue to also replace whatever inheritance taxes were being used for as well. So it sounds like the proposal for the increase in fees is beyond what it costs to administer that service. It's actually increasing to also make up for that lost inheritance tax revenues. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think it's a protection to protect the property taxes as well. Once you start thinking about, what the cost is to do a service. Again, we have the technology. In technology, you have cybersecurity. You have, there's a whole bunch of levels that go into the software, and then you have the people that still need to run that. And so when you think about the cost per service, and for these very specialized type things like marriage license or an individual's car inspection, things like that, should that be the burden of that? Should that go to more towards the person that's asking for it, or should that, because that other resource that we have obviously is the inheritance tax and property taxes are our main sources.
No, and that makes sense.
Yeah.
And perhaps we're getting even more into like the philosophy
Right.
of who should pay these taxes. But
Bringing him back up.
I'd be curious to know, and you may not have this information on hand, but the amount of individuals in the state of Nebraska who are affected by the inheritance tax every year. Do we know how many people pay the inheritance tax? I'm sure that the number has to exist. And I guess and maybe somebody else can answer this, but the bigger question I'm asking is, if we get rid of the inheritance tax, my curiosity would be, are we getting rid of a tax that's paid by a lesser amount of people and asking for a larger amount of people to pay more money to make up that difference, right? If you have 10 people who pay a tax and we get rid of that tax, and then you ask 90 or 100 people to pay a little more on a bunch of other things, are we asking a bunch of more people to make up the difference for what is only affecting a smaller proportion of people? Now, again, maybe that's the right thing to do in some people's eyes or not. It's getting to the philosophy, but I'm trying to figure out, increasing these fees affect a very large swath of people in the state. And they affect those people in what I perceive to be a fairly flat manner, right? And in doing so, we're asking that money to make up the difference for what's maybe not affecting quite as many people. That would be my concern. So the numbers on who's affected by the inheritance tax I'm curious about, especially as it is proportionate to the individuals who are utilizing the fees and the services that we're talking about increasing revenue from on this list. Part of a broader conversation, maybe somebody else has more of those numbers. And the last question I had for you then would be, in your sort of analysis of this, working through these working groups, have you seen, or what is the effect on inheritance taxes or finding revenue replacers with the new hard caps that have been put in place over this last legislative session, right? So we've seen now these new caps on political subdivisions. Does that play into the analysis that you're seeing with regards to finding revenue replacers, or what is the interplay between those two things?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, we don't know what we don't know yet. We've been doing a lot of modeling going from the lid on restricted funds to the cap environment. Obviously, under a recessionary year, this is something that's new to us. The counties, the cities are going to have to still keep their essential services. They still have to go to calls, and they'll still have to respond to snow emergencies, and they'll still have to take care of that bridge. So it is obviously a concern, especially in recessionary years right now. But I think there is an interplay. I think the one positive thing that did come out of going from a lid on restricted funds, because a lot of the restricted funds are revenues that would draw down the authority of the property taxes. So under the cap environment, these revenues right here are going to be outside of that authority to help us, grow with the services that we need. But right now, counties just don't have a lot of restricted funds under the lid, and so at this point, our reliance on property taxes is quite heavy, just because we just don't have a lot of revenue sources outside of property taxes, inheritance tax to do that. So, but it is definitely something that's in the back of our minds, especially I think when we start talking about unfunded and underfunded mandates. A lot of the info documents, I always call them one-pagers, but not one of these turned into one-pagers. But the info it's really showing that there is opportunity there to really look at those and see what opportunities there are to maybe look at those statutes, like you mentioned, Senator.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Next up, we invite Mary Ann Borgeson.
Afternoon, Chair Von Gillerin and Revenue Committee members. My name is Mary Ann Borgeson, MaryAnnBorgeson. I'm a Douglas County Commissioner. As you may be aware, counties have generally been opposed to the elimination of the inheritance tax, as this revenue source is one of our few sources that we receive in order to perform services mandated by the state legislature. Douglas County generally collects between 15 million and 19 million of inheritance tax annually, with the very recent amount exceeding 20 million. A loss of such significant amount of revenue, which has been relied upon for decades, will result in some consequences to our services. And this, again, keeping in mind that counties overwhelmingly rely on the property tax, and we do not have options to seek alternative revenue options, such as sales tax, wheels tax, occupation tax, user fees, etc. So the majority of Douglas County's inheritance tax revenue is used to fund county's community mental health center, general assistance, health department, veteran services, etc. These are very important health and human service functions that primarily serve those in our counties that are in most of need. Without an equal permanent replacement revenue source, the elimination of the inheritance tax could result in revenue loss and service reduction. The county board would have to either significantly cut certain services or increase our property tax levy. An approximate increase in the property tax would be about a 2.5 cents that would be required to level the health and human services to maintain those. So eliminating the inheritance tax does not result in any tangible benefit to the overwhelming majority of Nebraskans. And yet, if eliminated, this actually could result in a consequence for some residents, potentially in the form of overall service reduction and or property tax increases. Either or both could occur. And in consideration that a majority of county services and expenses are directly state mandated, such as public safety, corrections, maintaining local and state courts, among others, wide-reaching consequences could occur. So I basically just urge the committee to consider these possible consequences in our discussions going forward. And I too would like to thank Senator Von Gillerin for being a part of our committee and Senator Clements for being a good partner in these discussions. You know, I can sit here as a county commissioner and I can say, you know, nobody likes taxes, but we have depending on it because the only other source of revenue that we really have is property taxes. So we are about 13% of the property tax pie, the total pie. 13% is what we are as county. And we have about 30 unfunded mandates that equate to about $78 million. And Senator Von Gillerin or Senator Bostar asked about how many in Douglas County. There's 0.02% of our residents are affected by the inheritance tax. That's just in Douglas County. I don't know about the state. So with that, I would take any questions.
Questions from the committee, Senator Cow.
Thank you, Chair Von Gillerin. Ms. Borgeson, I have some questions about cost cutting and if you're spending the money wisely. And I want to ask about the Juvenile Justice Center, which how much did that cost to build from the county?
27.
And it's not being used.
It's not open yet. No.
So, and how much is it costing to keep it
About 20,000
active a month?
Mhm.
So you're spending $20,000 a month to keep a building that costs how much to build?
27.
27 million, and it's not being used.
Correct.
So when you look at how you're spending the county's money and saying that, well, you'd have to replace it with some other tax. I'm just wondering if the inheritance tax kind of makes things a little bit invisible. So there's not much transparency because people don't see that as being, I mean, if you have to raise property taxes, people are going to look a little closer at how the money is being spent.
Correct.
So I'm really concerned with what I see as very, very poor spending of taxpayers' money in Douglas County, and then asking for more or not being willing to get rid of one.
And that's a very good example of where we have as counties, we have no authority of who comes in or goes out. And one of the things we ran into when we started to plan the new center, our numbers were actually decreasing in terms of the number of youth. We actually increased the juvenile alternative initiatives tremendously.
That's when I've talked with the county attorneys and the sheriff, they say that they had advised you that you would need much more space.
Correct. So we were originally at 48. We met with them and it went to 64.
And they said you needed actually more than that.
They agreed on the 64. And then if you look at our numbers, we had a plan basically laid out for the months that we would need to transition to that new one. And then we did. We started to see an increase in juvenile crime like we hadn't seen in the past. And so it was decided that we would hold off until our numbers were reduced so we wouldn't have to run both facilities at the same time. And
So again, you're spending $20,000 a month of taxpayer money that's being taken from people who are working very hard to pay their own bills to keep a facility open that is not being used.
Yes.
And I have problems with not looking at cost-cutting measures and determining what are the priorities of the county so that you can cut some things
Right.
and not depend on inheritance taxes.
And we do, I mean, like even if you look at juvenile and you look at adult, if we didn't have the community corrections programs and juvenile detention alternatives that we have, we would need way bigger facilities. So what happens in the juvenile system is we have kids that are sitting in there for months and months and sometimes years, depending on how they're charged. And a lot of that is not under our control. So they come in, probation and the judge decides if they come in or they don't. And then once they're in there, it's the judge and probation that decides where they go. And then here's a good scenario is Johnny's going to go to Boys Town, but Boys Town doesn't have a bed for 3 weeks. So the child just sits there. Well, that takes up a bed. Again, the detention center isn't a placement. It is just a holding place till the judge decides where that juvenile should go next.
That's still not being used. I mean, that's my point is
Right.
you have something available and you're paying for it to not be used.
Right. So
So I don't think the county is spending their money appropriately. And I would prefer to see you guys figuring out what the actual priorities are
Yep.
in the county and get rid of some of those that don't need to be done.
like,
I don't know. That's,
well,
I-
so
I-
that's, and we do that every budget year. So we could get rid of all of our alternatives. But then again, you would have to, where would you put the children? They would go into a facility. So you would need a bigger facility and a much more expense. So what we're doing right now is we actually are in conversations with the state to say, is there a partnership for you need space for kids? We have space that we could maybe utilize together. And so we're waiting for some numbers and proposals from the state to say, can we partner in the use of this facility together? And again, there's going to be some children and there has been an increase in children being charged as adults because of some of the horrendous crimes that they have committed. So they're going to stay there for a lot longer than a child who's picked up for, shoplifting or something. And those kids should be able to be moved through more quickly than what they're being moved towards. One of the things probation runs into, because they're the ones who have the authority to say where that child or recommend to the judge where that child goes, is they're running into capacity issues at programs. They don't have enough capacity, the place don't have enough staff, or maybe they don't have the right type of program or service that the child needs to go to. So that's all looked at on a continuous basis, all the time. We have meetings with a huge child and youth committee to say, what can we do? Who can we work with? We've gone after many grants to try to figure out maybe that's a service that we could be providing or a program through grant dollars rather than property tax dollars to get them started and get the children to be moved more quickly. We've used the home monitoring program and added stability services so that there's more services wrapped around that child and family. So we look at that all the time. And it's the same way with the adult corrections as well. And that population, we've actually decreased. We're at the lowest that we've ever been in, well, my tenure anyway. But again, it's because we look at what are the folks being brought into and what are their needs? And so our pretrial program is a good example. We had every player in the judicial system that touches a person sitting at the table, and they had to basically help write and sign off on their piece of the pretrial program. So everybody was on board with it, and it's working. I mean, it is working. We have saved just this last month, I think the number was over $600,000 for people that did not have to just sit in jail and wait for a court date, but that they were on a pretrial status. And so we are trying to look at things. Community mental health center, same thing. We look at how we are able to get someone in recovery way quicker. And keep them in recovery rather than continually have them come back, go through the ERs, and then end up in our facility again. So we do that with, again, through our budgeting process, but on an ongoing basis through our committee structure when we meet with staff.
So do you have a list of the statutes or the regulations that could be gotten rid of that would help you save money?
So I have a list that I can get you of the unfunded mandates that we have. Yeah,
That'd be great.
and the underfunded as well.
I'd appreciate both
Sure.
of those. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I did send for the inheritance tax, I don't remember if it was at the end of the last session. I sent you all a PowerPoint of what Douglas County does with their inheritance tax. So we actually do have it separated, and then we list out where that money has gone every year. So how much goes to the community mental health center, how much goes to the health department, how much goes to veterans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all listed out in that PowerPoint.
I'll take that up. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Murphy.
Just a quick, the list of unfunded and underfunded mandates, I think I've seen that before, but could you send it to the whole committee?
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
Commissioner Borgeson, thank you. Quick question, what is the total budget for Douglas County?
About 500 and some.
Okay, so 15 and 19 million is a couple percent, 2 to 3%, okay. And then in fourth paragraph of your testimony, you talk about the funds for used for community mental health center, general assistance department, health department, veteran services. This goes back to a question I asked earlier. Are these funds restricted or unrestricted?
They're unrestricted, but that's but we'll use the inheritance tax dollars first part of that budgeting process rather than property.
But you could also say that you use the inheritance tax dollars to fund the jail and fix bridges and pay police and everything. Because if it goes into the general fund,
Yes,
it really pays for all of those things. correct?
whatever we decide
Okay,
where
but
that
these
should
are-
be used.
okay.
Yep, yep,
All right, thank you.
yep, it's not restricted.
Thank you. Seeing no other questions, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Next up, we're going to invite Brandy Burkett. Is it Burkett or Burkett? Burkett, thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. When do you want me to start?
Right now.
My name is Brandy Burkett. I'm in Legislative District 4. BRANDI BURKETT. Hi, my name is Brandy Burkett. I am a fifth generation Nebraskan who will inherit farmland from my mom in the future. The cost of the inheritance tax will be unaffordable to me. The future of farming is unknown, just like the weather. While we can't control the weather, we can control in helping to make sure the next generation to take over family farms can continue farming and keep their land in the family. Please keep in mind that there are approximately 45,000 family farms in Nebraska. When faced with an expensive price tag at the mall, we can just say no to buying a product. However, when faced with having to pay a tax, we can't say no because people are forced to pay it. Individuals that inherit land could be faced with a difficult decision of not being able to afford the inheritance tax, and instead of going into debt, they will sell the land quickly. You may think no big deal if they sell the land. However, to me, I think about who are they selling the land to? A corporate or individual that has foreign ties? Someone that will turn the land into a parking lot and not even use for growing more corn for ethanol? I will be blunt, I don't really care if the individual that inherits a house on 3rd Street in a small town sells the house, but I do care if farms start to die and the future of our food goes extinct. Therefore, I ask you to ask yourself, is the inheritance tax worth killing the future generation of farmers, or can you create a viable option in this never-ending world of inflation and help the great people of Nebraska out? Maybe charge an extra $5 on license plates so everyone has to pay it every year, including people who may never inherit land? Or can you even consider at least waiving the inheritance for agricultural land so family farms can continue growing and raising your food?
Thank you. Questions from the committee? Senator Berman.
Thank you for testifying. Would you say the same thing holds true with property taxes as what you just said about inheritance taxes as to the sustainability of family farms?
Correct. The rising cost in property taxes. Do I think it's optionable for us to completely get rid of property taxes? Probably not, but I would definitely suggest that there needs to be help when it comes to that in order to keep family farms going.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if I listen to your testimony accurately, if you inherit land but no cash to go with the land, you don't have any way to pay the inheritance tax on the land. You've got an illiquid asset, correct?
Correct. If you don't, I believe some people may, but some people may not.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you.
Next up, we invite Alex DeGarmo.
Good afternoon, Vice Chairman Von Gillern and members of the Revenue Committee. My name is Alex DeGarmo, ALEXDEGARMO. I'm the Chairman of the Cass County Board of Commissioners. For the record, I'd like to note I am taking vacation time from the legislature in order to testify today. I'd also like to thank Senator Clements for inviting me to testify. I do not oppose the reduction or elimination of the inheritance tax as long as a separate sustainable revenue stream is provided to make up for the loss of that revenue. The inheritance tax is the only significant stream of revenue besides property tax that we have as a county, and elimination without replacement would be detrimental to the essential operations of the county. In our current budget year, we brought in just over $2 million of inheritance tax. Of that, we've budgeted $225,000 for new cruisers for the sheriff's office, $15,000 for necessary security upgrades for the treasurer's office, and $36,000 for a truck for the weed board. The remainder of our inheritance tax dollars are set aside for any capital improvements that may come up throughout the year or emergency repairs to any of our buildings. As a Cass County Commissioner, I believe I'm a responsible steward of our tax dollars. And if I wasn't, I would hear from my constituent that's sitting right behind me here. And in order to divest our budget from property taxes, we need separate streams of significant revenue. And currently that's only inheritance tax. I would be supportive of any measure to reduce or remove inheritance tax as long as there's a consistent, sustainable revenue stream to make up for those lost dollars. Thank you for your time, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee members? What's left of us? Thank you. Seeing none, thank you. Next up, I invite Nicole Fox. Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Von Gillern and a member of the Revenue Committee. Nicole Fox, NICOLEFOX, Director of Government Relations for the Platt Institute. And we thank Senator Clements for his commitment to lessen the tax burdens imposed on Nebraskans. For years, Platt has been a strong advocate for repeal of Nebraska's inheritance tax. We've testified at previous interim studies on the topic, in addition to multiple legislative proposals. Last month, the Tax Foundation published its inaugural State Tax Climate Index. The index is comprised of 5 components, one of them being property and wealth taxes, for which Nebraska ranks 45th. As of January 2025, as Senator Clements mentioned, when Iowa's inheritance tax is officially phased out, Nebraska will be just one of 5 states to impose the inheritance tax. And as also been mentioned, Nebraska is unique in that it is collected at the county level as opposed to the state level. This, in addition to having the highest inheritance tax rate in the country, and that being the class 3 relatives at 15%, this significantly impacts our ranking. So both the top rate and the fact that we have it on the books is impacting our tax ranking. From June 2023 to July 2024, over 9,700 beneficiaries paid $84.2 million worth of inheritance taxes to Nebraska counties. And I'm going to digress here a little bit because I know on the report there are 2 different numbers. There's the 84.2 million, the 93.7 million. Based on conversations I've had with the Department of Revenue, they kind of steered me towards more the 84.2 million, which is why I mentioned that. And I know Senator Duncan was asking about the number of beneficiaries that this impacts. And like I said, 9,700. I used the total number of folks and not just residents, non-residents, just because I think it's important that, we do have people that leave the state. Some of this money is being, or not money, but, property is being given to relatives that have moved away from Nebraska. And I think we need to, do everything we can to get those people back here. So I think the fact that they maybe can inherit property and move back and take advantage of that property would be good to bring people to our state. Not only is the tax itself a burden, there are also other added costs to consider. There are costs associated with probate court. For those hoping to eliminate imposing tax liability on their loved ones, tax avoidance strategies and estate planning also come with a price tag, and not everybody has the resources to do that. Nebraskans are already paying some of the highest property taxes in the country, and they're begging for tax relief. And just real quick, I'm going to digress a little bit again here. Platt was invited to some of the working group over the interim. I will say that we were only able to be at 2 of those meetings, and they were very early meetings. So I'm not familiar. I'm not familiar with some of the discussions that were had later, but, we were definitely at the table just to listen and to say, just kind of be there to say, we support the idea of, trying to repeal this. We're thankful that NACO got a group of people together to try and talk about this and see if there is a solution. Additionally, I will bring up that, lots of things have been put on the table today. I'm used to going before NACO and some of the county commissioners. So I've been taking notes and just wanted to get a few things on the record. And first of all, Senator Calth, I appreciate some of your comments and questions because, things to kind of keep in mind here is just this balance and this way that we can come to some sort of agreement. If we had it our way, we would just say, get rid of this thing, repeal it, get it off the books, and let's move forward. But we also know that there's a reality. There's a reality that there are some senators that are concerned about their counties being made whole and different things. But again, it brings back to that balance because I think we have to be careful about, kind of tax shifting because again, the goal, here is to try and maybe, bring some relief to folks. When we're talking about things like fees, Platt has always said, I know when we're talking about, things like occupational licensing or whatever, we talk about fees and that, we want fees to be reasonable. We want fees that cover, the cost of administering a program, not just, the state charges more than we do, so we think that that's a good reason to increase it. So we want to make sure, again, we're looking at balance. I do think it's reasonable to take a look at unfunded mandates and, what are there things on the books that are antiquated? Because of course, if we can reduce costs, I think that's reasonable. So just that would be my thing, is that Platt would like to see, thoughtful balance, and also keeping in mind that Nebraskans are faced with increased costs every day. Nebraska businesses are also faced with increased costs, and we have to make tough decisions. And sometimes, we have to cut back. The other thing I'd ask of this committee is it moral and ethical to levy an additional tax on property where annual property taxes have already been levied, and they'll be continued to be levied when an original owner dies and a transfer of property is triggered. Additionally, inheritance tax is paid on investments like annuities and IRAs. This means the county is levying taxes on items where income tax is traditionally paid. Tax mobility is higher than ever, and taxpayers can change states to avoid placing a tax burden on their loved ones. We are discouraging people from staying in Nebraska and investing in our communities. And, kind of as I started, Platt Institute's very concerned about our tax competitiveness. We want to draw people to Nebraska. We want people investing in Nebraska, creating jobs, hiring workers. Most importantly, the inheritance tax fails to meet the stability principle when it comes to sound tax policy. It fails to provide steady revenues for core government functions, and therefore does not fit in a modern tax code. And we published a paper on the inheritance tax in 2021, and in that report, we found that inheritance tax, maybe provides about 3% of budgets. So I know that fluctuates greatly. Obviously, some counties collect much more than others. Some counties, there are years where they collect none. So as we look to 2025, I just want to emphasize that this getting rid of the inheritance tax, whether it's a phase out, this is a huge priority for us. It does affect our tax competitiveness, and we hope that members of this committee returning in 2025 will also make it a priority. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions from the committee, Senator Merman.
Thank you for your testimony. Do you have any numbers as to how many people leave the state that are past retirement age, or I know there's a lot of reasons. Well, there's no reason to leave the state, but they may have excuses. And if you do have any of those numbers, of course, it'd be hard to determine, I'm sure, if they leave because of inheritance tax or other reasons.
Yeah. I do know that there is migration data that is out there, and we've used that in some of the publications we've put out on a variety of tax topics. So I could get you those numbers, but yes, Senator Merman, as you mentioned, I can't say as to, why, or I couldn't say that, well, of these numbers, this is the number that left solely because of inheritance tax. But, we do know that people are leaving because of it.
Yeah, just having the numbers of the people that leave the state, older people that leave the state, of course, much older than me, that leave the state, would be useful. Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions? I just wanted a couple of quick comments. Your comment about is it moral and ethical to levy this tax on annual property taxes have already been levied. I also want to point out that some items that are inherited, well, most items that are inherited were purchased with after income tax dollars. Sales tax was paid when they were purchased. Property taxes were paid. If it's a vehicle, motor vehicle taxes were paid. And then if it's inherited, inheritance tax is going to be paid. So it's four or five levels of taxation on the same item. Correct?
Yes, correct. And you make a very good point. And yeah.
And then one last thing, and you mentioned it, and it reminded me that you were able to attend a couple of the working groups. I've received credit and/or blame for being part of the group, or you might have to look at it. I was unable to attend the meetings in the group. I appreciate the work that was done, but I don't want to get credit for work done by others. So just want to make sure that was clear. So thank you. Thank you for your testimony today.
Credit or blame.
Well, credit or blame, yeah, depending on where you're sitting. Last up, Doug Kagan. You had all this time to get ready.
Good afternoon, Doug Kagan, Dougkagan, 416 South 130th Street, Omaha, representing Nebraska Taxpayers for Freedom. A major objection to ending the state inheritance tax stems from those concerned that the resulting fiscal deficit will result in a property tax increase. We suggest that county officials instead examine alternative means to replace the lost revenue. One source is requiring the state to pay for or to prohibit not only the increasing unfunded and underfunded mandates placed on counties, but also the higher levels of service, more expensive services required later on. Examples are the court and probation costs. Secondly, counties should implement zero-based budgeting in all their departments, forcing them to justify every expense for a future fiscal year. Private companies and government agencies find it an effective tool to identify and eliminate unnecessary costs and control spending. So you would calculate cost versus benefit justification for each expenditure required. Every item scrutinized to determine if a program, service, or activity merits reduction or removal. Managers must account for all elements of a budget and identify cost savings areas. Third, counties could conduct work audits. Desk audits require justification for every job position to verify if work responsibilities performed are vitally necessary or overlap other work. Performance audits provide objective analyses and conclusions to assist management to improve workflow and reduce costs. These actions can improve and streamline workplace operations. Finally, we suggest that county governments eliminate all non-basic operations from their budgets. Examples from Douglas County include eliminating the law library and extension service. And right after I wrote this, something else came to mind, and that is just very, very recently, we found out that Douglas County is losing out on a lot of prospective revenue because right now, across the river, Potawatomi County rakes in millions of dollars from the Immigration Service by housing criminal illegal aliens. The Douglas County Jail currently does not do that. So the Immigration Service, which does not care about state boundaries, they take all the criminal illegal aliens from eastern Nebraska, including Douglas County, and they put them in the Potawatomi County Jail. And Potawatomi County makes millions of dollars from that. Douglas County could make a lot of that money if we kept the illegal aliens detained in Douglas County. So therefore, we urge county officials to concentrate on implementing these solutions to expected revenue loss stemming from inheritance tax elimination. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Questions from the committee members? Seeing none, thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
And that is our last testifier. Senator Clements, would you like to close?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few closing remarks. And I'm definitely open to suggestions for other revenue sources for counties. We've looked at a lot of them, but there are other potentials. Motor vehicle taxes and motor vehicle fees, we've looked a lot at those. It's very complex. One thing we found is that the schools get $200 million a year of motor vehicle taxes revenues from vehicle licenses, which they're not having to build roads, but the counties are. It might make some sense to give the counties some more of the motor vehicle fees, but everybody knows the motor vehicle licensing is already very high. And so we didn't consider increasing anything with motor vehicle licensing. But we're continuing to research that, and my staff has been working on that along with Department of Motor Vehicles. We found that there are, right now, the motor vehicle tax quits when your car is over 14 years old. And there are 1 million cars on the road in Nebraska over 14 years old, not paying a motor vehicle tax. One thought was maybe have them pay $25 forever to be able to use the road. That'd be $25 million. But I think before we did that, we'd want to we were thinking, try to reduce the overall cost of licensing because we are out of line. But anyway, we'll still be working on that as another possibility. The civil fees that were mentioned, there are some potential revenues, but some may be eliminated, and actually overall probably a small amount as far as affecting this program. You asked about the amount of inherited, how much average is inherited. You have a inheritance tax report from the state, and I did some calculations from the state. The amounts paid per class. Children class 1, there's 12,267 beneficiaries. The average amount they inherited was $526,000, and at 1%, after the $100,000 exemption, they paid $4,260 of tax each. Then look at nieces and nephews, class 2, there were 1,258 of those. Their average inherited amount was $195,000, but they paid $17,000 in tax each, where the people inheriting $500,000 paid $4,000, inheriting $295,000 paid $17,000. And the non-relatives, 435 of those, their average receipt was $185,000, and at the 15% rate, they paid $24,000 in tax on $185,000 of inheritance, whereas the children with $500,000 pay only $4,000. So that's why I'm targeting the class 2 and 3 first. So there were 13,960 total beneficiaries on that report for a year. Regarding a few people paying for, switching that from a few people paying to everybody paying, I think is the right thing to do, because these people aren't using all those roads. It's everybody else that's using them. That's why I'd like to see this eliminated. And with, as far as people leaving the state, Senator Merman, I don't have figures on how many people would have left, especially because of inheritance tax. But I have had emails from people who said, I'm out of here, a 50-year resident of Nebraska, and now I'm in Florida. One guy said, I've got a house in South Dakota and I've got a house in Florida, and I'm not dying in Nebraska because he has no children. And he said, the county's not going to get 11% of my life savings. So he's gone. And also I've heard from the state planners that advise people don't get caught dead in Nebraska. And but I don't have numbers for that. Then one final thing on this trend line graph, you'll look at 2000 and up to 2005, it was really flat, and then it takes off. in 2001, the federal estate tax was changed where the Nebraska tax paid wasn't a credit. And there was, the inheritance tax formula was reworked. They increased some of the exemptions, but then to make up for that loss of revenue, they increased the rates. And I don't remember what the rates were. I think class 2 was 9%, and it went up to 13%. Then a bill that I had a couple of years ago brought it down to 11%. But I believe that's a factor of why that took off. And then just growth of people's asset estate, especially land values, has also caused quite an increase in the inheritance taxes paid and the dollar amounts that people have to come up with to try to inherit some, especially farmland, is prohibitive in order to try to keep land in the family. And I welcome any other questions.
Questions from the committee members? Seeing none, thank you. Senator Clements.
Thank you.
That will close our hearing on LR 314. We will open on LR 435. Welcome, Senator Raybould. Afternoon.
Good afternoon, Vice Chair Senator Von Gillern and members of the Revenue Committee. My name is Jane Raybould, Janeraybould, and I represent Legislative District 28. I introduced Legislative Resolution 435 to assess the loss of funding to Nebraska counties as a result of an elimination of the Nebraska inheritance tax, and to identify potential state funding sources to replace lost revenue to Nebraska counties as a result of an elimination of the Nebraska inheritance tax. And I'm going to skip a lot of my written testimony because I think you've heard a lot of this before. It's kind of ironic. I was here before a different revenue committee back in 2014 when I was a Lancaster County Commissioner. And back then I was testifying in opposition to LB 960. And I was testifying in opposition to LB 812, which was yet another attempt to do an elimination of the inheritance tax. I have to thank Senator Clements. He has done a phenomenal job. I love the fact that he has dived deep down in the weeds, but it's thanks to the data and the collection of important information from NACO, certainly by John Cannon, by Candace Meredith, and all the outreach that they had with the 93 counties across the state of Nebraska, asking them the specific question: how would this impact you? What are the elements that would need to be eliminated? And what other sources of revenue would you suggest that we look at that would help supplant the loss of inheritance tax? And I think we've heard a lot of interesting things, but I'm going to go back to my 2014 testimony because I think it just brings the same issues back, the same issues up again and again. In Lancaster County, the inheritance tax plays a key role in balancing our budget and keeping property taxes as low as possible. All inheritance tax revenue is deposited in the county's general fund to help cover operating expenses, thereby providing direct property tax relief. We've heard a lot about this, certainly this past special session in particular. While the legislature has created numerous mandated responsibilities for counties, our revenue tools are very limited. It makes no sense to reduce one of the few revenue sources available to counties. If the inheritance tax is decreased, there is no guarantee the additional money received by the beneficiaries will stay in our community, or for that matter, the state of Nebraska. On the other hand, Every cent of inheritance tax collected will be invested in our community. I think Senator Clements gave that one example of one of the individuals would be inheriting $195,000. The inheritance tax for the state of Nebraska would cost that individual $17,000. We cannot lose sight of the fact any Nebraskan who inherits the balance of $175,000 would be beyond thrilled to pay that inheritance tax to the state of Nebraska. That $17,000, you've heard it from other testifiers of what it goes towards in those counties. It takes care of bridges, it takes care of roads, it takes care of culverts, it takes care of radios for the sheriff's department, it takes care of upgrades to their 911 call centers, it takes care of their ambulances and fire trucks, it takes care of the community center roof that needs to be replaced, it takes care of an elevator that goes out in Seward County that needs funding to replace. And I've heard before that, okay, some counties have reserves. Some counties intentionally keep reserves going, and for one very fundamental reason. They need to be able to make that match so that they can get the funding from the state of Nebraska to fix that bridge. Because we all know fixing bridges is essential for a rural community to transport their grain and products to the grain elevator. So these are fundamental things. You've heard a lot about it, and I don't want to keep going back and forth on it, but I really applaud the efforts of NACO and Senator Clements to really find those elements that we can supplant this loss of revenue. And certainly fees are one of them. I think Candace gave the example of a deputy in a county sheriff's office. They get $2 to serve a distress warrant. Now, I know for a fact that other counties have already raised those fees, despite the fact that they're required to keep it at $2. But they can't make ends meet. That does not even cover the cost of gas to get out to some trailer court outside the city or community to cover the cost of their time and materials. And I think that's what they're focusing on, to look at, can those fees be raised commensurate with the administrative costs involved? I can speak of the city of Lincoln. Water. You know, we constantly look at the water rates in the city of Lincoln, but we keep up with that increase in the cost and administrative charges, as well as the infrastructure improvements, by looking at it thoughtfully and carefully and fiscally responsibly, increasing those rates. They are announced, and to this fact, and to this day, the city of Lincoln has some of the most affordable water rates in the entire city, or in the entire state of Nebraska, because you do these thoughtful approaches. And by the way, it hasn't impacted the city of Lincoln and their bonding authority and ability to get funding. We have a AAA bond rating, which allows us to get the lowest interest rates when it comes to financing projects and bonds. The other thing I wanted to mention, you had asked questions about mandated responsibilities, and I could spend a little bit of time on that, but you know, we talked about how many people does this really impact? And I could just go back to 2014 in my testimony. It says, make no mistake, eliminating the inheritance tax will result in a tax shift to the average property taxpayer. You've heard that from others. Of the 761 probate actions processed by the Lancaster County Court in 2011, that's when I started my gig as a county commissioner, only 563 cases resulted in an inheritance tax transaction in the county. In comparison, replacing these funds with a property tax increase will come right out of the pocket of every hardworking real property owner in the county. So that goes back to that fundamental philosophy. If you have a marriage license, I don't have, you know, say I'm a divorcee, I don't have a marriage license, but you're paying for that, as you should. But you should pay the appropriate fee and charge. In a county, they're hamstrung. They cannot increase those fees without applying to the state of Nebraska to give them a grace and allow them to do that. I think what they're saying, it should be fair and free and not onerous to our taxpayers that have to pay this. I know in my testimony, I also said that over the last 3 budget years, Lancaster County averaged an inheritance tax collection of almost $8 million. And they can budget for it. Many counties do budget based on projections and estimations. So the loss of this revenue of $8 million to Lancaster County back in 2014 would potentially require a reduction of 150 jobs, representing nearly 19% of our entire workforce. Our constituents in our cities and our counties rely on government to deliver on the services that they have come to expect and appreciate. If we continue to go down this pathway of restricting our ability to do our mandated, statutorily required jobs without coming up with a really thoughtful revenue replacement, then we're not doing our service to our county, our city, our community, or our state. The other thing I wanted to talk about that I also found very interesting, and John Cannon referenced this, it was the Nebraska Survey Key Findings done in February of 2023. I'm just going to hit the top items. I thought this was interesting. It says over 3 in 5 voters have a positive view of their county government. Just over half feel the same way about the state legislature. So that should give one pause, thinking that they feel that their county is appropriately and fiscally responsibly spending their tax dollars. A majority of Nebraskans say that every type of tax tested is too much. They are most adamant about property taxes being too high, and we have heard that. Nebraska voters want the state legislature to focus on eliminating or drastically reducing property taxes or state income taxes. Just 12% point to inheritance tax. 53% say property taxes is a real issue, just 12%. Most Republicans want the state legislature to focus on cutting property taxes, followed by state income, and then sales. Inheritance tax ranks last for them or is not even brought up. Majorities across party lines find the inheritance tax to be acceptable. I believe Senator Clements said 70% find it unacceptable. That is not the case for some of the statistics that are shown on this page of a survey that was done in 2023. I think Senator Ron Gill, and you talked about it, younger men are the most likely to find the inheritance tax acceptable, while older men are the least likely. The inheritance tax is generally seen as acceptable in all major regions of the state. 3 in 4 voters support the state dedicating other tax revenues to maintain county services if the inheritance tax is eliminated. I think what else I wanted to dive into briefly, if I could, is, if we're dead set on eliminating the inheritance tax, I think it must be coupled, and you've heard this from other people, to restrict unfunded or underfunded mandates from the state. That's not a new issue. I know that in 2014, Senator Sue Crawford introduced legislation about unfunded mandates in the counties. I can tell you I was fortunate to attend a National Association of County Officials from all across the United States. Several other states like Oregon and Washington have already implemented this. So it's a guardrail for the legislatures to be mindful of anything that you pass, well-intentioned, that has great beneficial value to the people that we serve in our state, also has a fiscal obligation. And I think we're fortunate when we go out for fiscal notes, the counties are very responsive and can tell you exactly how that's going to impact them. That information that they provide is essential, I have found, to make really good policy decisions. In the report that was done in 2014, it detailed 16 actionable steps in the legislature could take to address some of the most pressing unfunded mandates to the counties. And you've heard it before, some unfunded mandates are office space all up and down with the courts, with DHHS, you name it. There's requirements for the counties to provide office space, built out, livable, workable office space to all these entities. We've heard correctional facilities, indigent defense, courtroom security, and housing inmates convicted under state laws. NACO updated that report in 2019 when Senator Wayne introduced this similar study. And of course, Senator Blood has countlessly, 3 times at least, introduced for unfunded mandate. And as we have established, it's not just for counties, it impacts all political subdivisions. We have moved forward on some of the issues in the 2014 report, but many remain and more are added every year. Some, like marriage license fees, were adjusted once in the last 50 years, but need to be revisited to reflect increased administrative costs. And, you know, that's not to say all changes are bad. Many serve our public and are beneficial to Nebraskans. This study is to remind us that we as a body need to be aware of the costs, the requirements we place on local governments and how they will be funded. Okay, so I'm just going to give you some examples. I know motor vehicle building. Lancaster County provides 1,651 square feet to the state, and this includes utilities and custodial services that they're required to pay. The county treasurer collects sales taxes and remits to the state through the motor vehicle division. Collected was $29,238,776 in fiscal year 12, and collection fees kept by the state were $1,800. So we're talking $29,238,000 that they were obligated to collect for the state, and they were reimbursed $1,800. And it goes on. Election commissioner, think of all the petitions, ballot initiatives that we had on the ballots just this November. The state pays zero of those costs, zero of those costs. They pay zero of listing all of the state senators that ran for reelection and new state senators that run. I mean, I have the ones from Lancaster County. I have the ones from Sarpy County. I know that we heard that Douglas County has theirs as well. These are real. They're not made up, and they're not made intended to detract from the good things the counties do. I also want to just spend just a moment talking about my experiences as a county commissioner. As a business owner, business person, I can do my own cost benefit analysis. But when I came in back in 2011, I was determined to create these efficiencies in government that we love to talk about. I was determined to do it. I went down to purchasing. I looked at their stuff. I was totally humbled by the amount of software that they had that can really number crunch like crazy, look at the bids and try to find savings. I was humbled by the individuals in each one of the departments and the work that they were able to do to be very mindful of their budget and to deliver on their commitment to help us keep our property tax rate low and affordable and reasonable for everyone. I heard a comment from a gentleman about like Potawatomi County. They've got it figured out. You know, they'll house all these undocumented immigrants. That is just not true. The only way you can house undocumented immigrants, and if you want a hold on them, you have to reach out to the federal government. The federal government is the one who reimburses for each and every one of those jail holds. And guess what? How much do they pay Lancaster County? Zero. They will not pay us for detaining these individuals. And that is the reason why oftentimes these people get cited, they get held, but they are not detained because they're undocumented, because the federal government does not pay for this. I have seen the good that we have done in Lancaster County with the inheritance tax. We've heard comments and discussions about people like, you know, we're going to lose our family farm. It's very similar to the example of that Senator Clements gave of about inheriting $195,000. You pay that inheritance tax. Many farmers, I would say most farmers, are very good at estate planning. I'm fortunate to be part of a grocery family as well. We have had estate planning. I assure you that the inheritance tax of the state of Nebraska is a pittance. It is so irrelevant to the fiscal responsibility that is extracted from you from the federal government and your liability there. We are fortunate to have good estate planning. A lot of farmers are the same way. Unfortunately, what we see in our farming communities, if you have multiple siblings, they want to sell that land because that is their inheritance. They want that land sold. And that's some of the things that we're facing today. So I want to say thank you very much for the opportunity. And I really applaud the creativity of Senator Clements. He's onto something. He really is. If we really are determined to do away with inheritance tax, like they have been trying year after year after year, we realize it's not as easy as we thought it would be. And we have to figure out ways to make our counties whole in this. Not because we feel obligated to do so, is because even with the additional lids we put on the counties, we're making it more and more challenging. them to do the statutorily mandated obligations that they must fulfill to the state of Nebraska. So I pledge to you today that I want to continue to work with Senator Clements and NACO on coming up with reasonable and fair ways that we can work together if we want to eliminate the inheritance tax, but it has to become coupled with legislation that I do plan to introduce this coming session on unfunded mandates. There are essential guardrails for the state of Nebraska to live up to their job of not putting undue burdens on the counties and the cities. So thank you for your time. I'll try to answer some of your questions, but I'm hoping the really officials like Candace Meredith is going to fill in all the details in my gaps.
Thank you. Questions from the committee members? Must have been very thorough. Thank you. Appreciate your
welcome.
testimony.
Got lots of handouts.
Invite up John Cannon.
Yeah.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Vice Chair Von Gillen, distinguished members of the Revenue Committee, my name is John Cannon, Joncannon. I'm the Executive Director of NACO, here to testify on LR 435. First, I certainly appreciate Senator Raybould's comments. I don't think I could present that any more ably than she did. And also to avoid being unnecessarily cumulative, we're getting a little bit later on a Friday afternoon before the Wisconsin game. I'll incorporate much of my prior testimony by reference.
Thank you for being here.
You've been a great crowd, tip your waitress. So, I think that Senator Raybould got into a very good discussion on unfunded mandates. That's been a pervasive issue for many, many years. And we are creatures of the state. Senator Bostard had mentioned that. And the state can pass costs on to us for sure. There's no question about that. And they can pass on duties and responsibilities that are for the common good. And that is what we're here for. I mean, we're not trying to shirk our duty or shy away from any of those sorts of things. But a cost that's passed down to the counties is a cost that is ultimately going to be borne by the property taxpayer. And at the end of the day, one of the things that we continue to talk about is, what can we do to reduce the property tax burden? And so when we talk about the inheritance tax being the only other major source of revenue that counties receive, it's going to be bound up in that conversation about property taxes. And just as an example, Sarpy County, they've averaged about $3.2 million a year in inheritance tax receipts over the last several years. And they've recently done a study where they estimate about $17 million in unfunded mandates is something that they're responsible for. I've had conversations with a number of people, and I said, if the state wants to take care of unfunded mandates, I'll give away the inheritance tax. And for whatever reason, I've not gotten any takers. How peculiar. But again, going back to my prior testimony, I think what is probably the most beneficial thing that we could do is really engage in that top to bottom conversation about what are those things that are so peculiarly local. I'm not going to say that every mandate that comes to the counties is an unfunded mandate that we should just avoid. What is the proper division of labor? What are those things that are so peculiarly local that the county, in fact, should be taking care of it as part of its duty as a political subdivision of the state? What are those sorts of things that truly are statewide purposes? And so, again, I'll go back to the riparian vegetation management example that I had earlier. Those are the sorts of things where, we got out of a $72 million lawsuit. We ended up paying the state of Kansas $5 million. And the investment by the state of Nebraska to save itself $67 million was way less than that. And so I think having that conversation as to what are the sorts of things that we do at the county level that are state responsibilities versus those that are truly local, I think that's probably the best direction that we can take when we get to the subject of unfunded mandates. And again, I will just say that I reincorporate my prior testimony by reference. As far as the inheritance tax is concerned, I think that there's been a lot of thoughtful conversation, a lot of really diligent work that has gone into examining the sources of revenue through fees and other taxes that counties have available to them and figuring out the best way forward as far as the citizens of Nebraska getting the services they expect and paying the proper amount on a per capita basis. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cahan. Any questions from the committee members? Senator Duncan.
Thank you, Vice Chair Von
Senator
Gillen.
Duncan.
I'll be
go for it.
quick. Thank you again, Mr. Kane, for being here. In the conversation that we're having around unfunded mandates and local versus state level funding, I guess I'm curious the level of conversation you've had with other stakeholders or internally in NACO with regard to the cost and expense at the county level for corrections. You look at the Lancaster County budget, and I think the proposed budget that was just approved recently has corrections at about $37 million. I think it's the second highest line item for the county. So when we start talking about things that are inextricably intertwined, we're talking about county costs, I think we have to have a conversation about corrections. Has that been something that's been discussed with regards to ways counties can reduce the amount they're spending on corrections, whether that's getting more people on pretrial release services or shorter sentences or any kind of like conversations surrounding that you've had with regards to inheritance tax?
Yeah, we've broached that subject. It's probably not as complete as I would like to have for purposes of this conversation. So I'll keep my powder dry for just a little bit. But you're absolutely correct, sir. The corrections is a huge line item for counties statewide. And just as an example of some of the, I don't want to say unintended consequences, but some of the things that that are very peculiar issues for corrections at the county level is the cost of transport. As you're probably aware, not every county has a jail, so not every county has corrections. Those counties will contract with another county through an interlocal agreement of some sort where they're going to pay to place somebody there and hold a bed. But once that happens, then all of a sudden when that person has their arraignment or their court date or any of the other things that they have to do, there's a cost of transport. And not in the actual cost of gas going down the road to go, to take that prisoner there. But also there's the cost of, I've got a sheriff's deputy who's going to be out of the office one way and then the other way. And oh, by the way, if I'm in a small county and we only have, the sheriff and two deputies, that's going to be a huge burden on the county from a manning perspective as well. And so, I would like to go further. The cost is huge, and I would say that statewide, it's probably something that is a significant cost for the counties. I'll also mention that when there's a prosecution, you don't see the caption of the case read Lancaster County versus Smith. It says state versus Smith, and so there's definitely a state purpose that's being applied here. But the question is how peculiarly local is that? I mean, that we're not prosecuting people in Lancaster County, you're not prosecuting people from Boone County, for instance. You're prosecuting people from the population. And so I think there's probably a reasonable balance as far as what the state should be responsible for, but also what the county should be responsible for housing the prisoners from its community.
Well, and I appreciate that. I just think that we as a committee moving forward into the next year and we as a legislature need to make sure that we're focusing on that. I know oftentimes we sort of bifurcate the issues when they're pertaining to criminal justice and finance, but they're obviously very, very related when we're talking about what we can save money on. And so I would appreciate to continue having that conversation on the county level as it pertains to the effect on property tax and replacement revenue when we're spending so much money on essentially extended incarceration. So happy to have that conversation as we move forward.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Duncan. Any other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Cannon, for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
And is Ms. Meredith testifying? Already covered? All good? Okay.
I mean, she got volunteered. Not by me. I kind of want to see what happens.
All right. Senator Raybould, would you like to close it all? Or?
I think Marion Borges.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. I got my list wrong here. Thank you. We invite up Commissioner Borgeson.
Thank you.
My apologies.
No, that's fine, and I won't take long because I'll just basically say what I had said earlier in terms of the number of unfunded mandates. Douglas County, there's about 30 of them. And just to give you a couple examples that also have been given by Senator is the office space that we have to pay for, the court space that we have to pay for, that we have no authority or say over any of that. But some of the most recent ones was we looked at what our costs were to house DHHS juveniles and probation juveniles, and our cost was $458. That was the per diem cost that we said we would need in our new contracts, and the state refused to pay that. The only amount that they agreed to was $334. So the rest of that is picked up by the counties. And so again, these all begin to add up. And the huge one is the mental health. When state went through behavioral health reform and closed down the regional centers, there's good and bad to that. Obviously, we're in support of people being able to be served in their communities by their loved ones, by their friends and families. But at the same time, we did not have the services, the resources to ratchet up those services within our communities. And we warned the state that this would happen, and it did, and that was they go to jail. So our jails are filling up with those with mental illness. We hit, not a good stat, we hit 51% of our adult correction folks have a mental illness. And those range from serious persistent mental illness to just having some depression, which is still an issue. But 51% of the individuals, and they're being housed in our jails. Not right, but we have to. We put off for a very long time. You talk about wanting to be responsible. We did not want to be a mental health facility or provider, but we had them in our jails. So you have to do something. And they were with us. And so we started to provide mental health services within our jail for these individuals to be able to at least stabilize them or get them on a road where we would be able, when they got released, to be back out into the community with some community providers that could continue their recovery services. So that's a huge one. And again, we're also seeing it was in the adult, but we're seeing it a lot in our juveniles as well. So mental health is a big one that we actually do provide. And I think we can say subsidize the state services for those individuals with mental health services. But I'll get you the list of those 30 that we have. Again, it goes from the just office space all the way to actual contractual arrangements that we have with the state for various services.
Okay, thank you. Before I forget, would you spell your name for the record?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Maryann, capital B as in Bob, Orgeson.
And any questions from committee members? Seeing none, thank you again.
Okay.
My apologies for.
No,
stepping back. Were there anybody else? Okay, Senator Raybould.
Thank you all very much for your dedication to being here on a Friday afternoon. You know, I just wanted to follow up on some of the other things. When I started as Lancaster County Commissioner, the first thing the state of Nebraska did was do away with the state assistance to counties and to cities. I remember right away in Lancaster County, that was a $1.4 million deficit that we had to figure out how to bridge, because we're required, as we all are, to make sure that our budgets are balanced. For the city of Lincoln, it was $1.6 million, doing away to the state aid to cities and counties. The other thing that I know that Maryann had addressed as well is funding for jail reimbursements. The state of Nebraska, when I came on board back in 2011, said, nope, we're just not going to reimburse you for the amount that we owe you. Back then, it was $8 million that the state of Nebraska owes us. And unfortunately, the tab keeps rolling and rolling and rolling. When it comes to individuals that have been sentenced by the courts to go to the regional center to be restored to their competency if they have a mental health issue, and the regional center is obligated to take care of them. But unfortunately, there's not enough beds in the regional center. So these individuals stay housed in the Lancaster County Jail. The state has not been reimbursing the counties for doing just that, taking care of their responsibility that the state is falling short of. And so, I mean, there's more and more examples of these that we could share, but not on a Friday afternoon. But I do want to read just one comment from someone I admire tremendously. His name is Ray Stevens. He is a former Lancaster County Commissioner, and I actually ran against him in order to win my seat on the Lancaster County Board. Ray and I are now friends. We ride our bikes together. But this is what Ray said when we had the debate earlier this legislative session. He says, "Dear Senators, I appreciate watching the debate on the inheritance tax. Some arguments I agree with, some I don't. We all have our own views of these taxes. What I strenuously disagree with is the lack of a clear, total, and permanent reimbursement plan for the counties. In the case of Lancaster County, the revenue alternative is property taxes, which I understand you're working to reduce. The legislature cannot congratulate themselves on eliminating a tax while at the same time forcing a lower-ranking political subdivision to raise their revenue stream. That is not good public policy. I hear a jail reimbursement. When this existed 20 years ago, the legislature met their revenue shortfall through funding out, which over several years means a $17 million gap in state revenue coming directly to Lancaster County taxpayers. A total and permanent revenue solution to county governments must be a part of the discussion of inheritance taxes, or you are ignoring the laws of unintended consequences." So I wanted to give a shout out to Ray Stevens and for his words of wisdom. So thank you all very much for your patience.
Very good. Any questions? Seeing none, thank you, Senator Raybould.
All right, thank you all and have a
Close
happy
our-
Thanksgiving.
Thank you, too. We'll close our testimony on 4:35 and close out our revenue hearing this afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Go Big Red.
You know, Ray, not that.
I'm not, am I?
You're not ashamed.
I learned not to wear purple. I got called out on that.